They say the dead can't speak, but what if they're listening? Listening from beneath the church floorboards, from inside the dark wooden booths where you thought you were safe. In 1734, Father Thomas Thornton didn't just arrive in Havenwood to lead a parish. He came to harvest secrets from the lips of the guilty and the pious alike. This wasn't confession. This was surveillance, and those who whispered their sins into the wooden mouths of the church never knew their words would echo into the hands of a family that ruled Maryland with something more powerful than muskets: knowledge of your guilt. What you're about to hear is dangerous. It has been locked away, hidden behind ecclesiastical privilege, and buried beneath the silence of 3 centuries. The Thornton family didn't just manipulate religion, they weaponized it, not with fire and brimstone, but with whispered confessions, recorded in secret and used to control the men who ran the colony: plantation owners, judges, ship captains, even rival clergy. No one was safe. This story is not for the faint of heart. It's not entertainment. It's transformation. If you're here to be amused, leave now. But if you're ready to look behind the curtain and learn how the sacred became a mechanism of domination, keep watching. Because once you know what the Thornton family did, you'll begin to see patterns. Patterns still echoing today, behind pulpits, behind corporate boardroom walls, and behind the polished smiles of those who claim to speak for God. They're still here, different names, same tactics. The only difference is, now you know how it started. The confessional booth, the supposed safe haven for the soul, became a trapdoor, and beneath it, in the echo chamber of St. Bartholomew's, the Thornton nephews turned sin into currency and mercy into blackmail. The walls of the church weren't designed to keep the devil out. They were built to keep the parishioners in silence, in fear. And now, as we trace the steps of this forgotten empire of ecclesiastical terror, you must ask yourself, if this happened once, how many times has it happened again? And more chillingly, how many times is it still happening behind velvet curtains and sacred oaths? Welcome to the macabre history of the Thornton family. The descent begins now. The town of Havenwood never suspected a thing. To the people who filled the pews of St. Bartholomew's each Sunday morning, the Thorntons were a gift from God, devout, articulate, and generous. Father Thomas's sermons stirred something primal in them. He spoke of sin with such authority that men felt their souls laid bare. He warned them of hidden evils in the eyes of angels, always watching. But what he never told them, what he couldn't tell them, was that the true eyes weren't heavenly. They were hidden in the walls. You see, Father Thornton wasn't merely a priest. He was an architect of fear. And what he built in Havenwood wasn't a parish. It was a prison made of secrets. His confessional booths were not simply places of redemption. They were engineered to extract power, power that didn't come from the divine, but from knowing exactly what a man feared most being known. The pipes under those booths, tin tubes, precisely angled, turned whispered sins into ammunition. His nephew Marcus built the booths. His younger nephew Samuel recorded what came through them: names, dates, faces, affairs, bribes, illegal trade. And when a man left those booths, lighter in spirit, Father Thornton knew he owned him. But there was something deeper, something even more sinister than blackmail. The Thorntons weren't just collecting secrets to control individuals. They were building a system, a map of guilt, a hierarchy of corruption. Every confession added a thread to a dark web stretched across Maryland, anchoring spiritual authority to real-world leverage, political influence, economic advantage, silent dominion. And the people? They obeyed. They confessed. again and again, terrified of eternal damnation, but never imagining they were delivering their souls into the hands of men who didn't believe in forgiveness, only obedience. By the spring of 1735, the Thorntons had installed theirs, easy booths in 3 parishes. But it wasn't enough. Father Thomas wanted more. He didn't just want to cleanse sin, he wanted to manufacture it. And he understood one thing: if you preach guilt loudly enough, the people will come to beg you to take their sins from them, and in doing so, they give you everything. This wasn't just corruption. This was spiritual totalitarianism, and the worst part? The victims believed they were being saved. Keep listening, we're only beginning to dig. If you've made it this far, prove you're not like them. Comment, "Secrets carve power" below, twice. Once for who you were, once for who you're becoming. Richard Whitmore's silence was bought. Edmund Curther's guilt was weaponized. But they were only the first bricks in a cathedral of control the Thorntons were constructing, one whispered sin at a time. By autumn of 1735, the Thornton family's network had become something more than a conspiracy. It had evolved into a living organism, fed by shame and structured by ritual. What looked like piety was actually precision. Each Sunday sermon became a test of compliance. Each communion a loyalty oath, each confession a new entry in the ledgers of psychological control. But behind every empire lies a deeper philosophy, and Father Thomas Thornton's was chilling in its clarity. There is no greater leverage than the guilt a man believes God himself has witnessed. He didn't care if you believed in salvation, he only needed you to believe in sin. And sin was everywhere. Farmers who cheated their workers, wives who strayed once in grief, judges who pocketed bribes, slaves who prayed to gods older than Christ. Thornton's nephews cataloged every deviation, and in their records they created categories, what they called corridors of the fallen. They didn't just record transgressions, they ranked them, prioritized them, assigned value to each confession based on 2 key metrics: shame density and social risk. The more a sin could unravel a man's life if exposed, the higher its value in the system. This wasn't the church anymore, it was a marketplace of secrets. But the genius wasn't in what they took, it was in how they justified the taking. Father Thornton developed an entire doctrine, a shadow theology, that turned obedience into penance. Victims weren't blackmailed, they were guided. Payments weren't extortion, they were offerings. And control, that was framed as divine discipline. He had reverse-engineered salvation, and men lined up to buy it, never realizing they were selling themselves. The church pews of Havenwood grew heavier with the weight of unspoken truth. Fathers sat beside daughters they had betrayed. Merchants tithed from profits soaked in blood. Mothers sang hymns to a God who no longer lived in the rafters, but whispered through pipes beneath their feet. And still, none of them knew. Because the genius of the Thorntons was this: they convinced an entire town that they were dirty, and only the church could wash them clean. And you? You're beginning to see how deep this goes. Don't look away now. The darkness is only beginning to speak. By the start of 1736, the Thorntons weren't just priests. They were predators' investments. The parishioners still kneeled, still confessed, still begged for absolution. But now, they were kneeling before a machine, and it was expanding. In letters inked with careful euphemisms and sealed with wax bearing the sign of the cross, Father Thornton began corresponding with higher clergy in Baltimore, Philadelphia, even Quebec. But his intent wasn't spiritual outreach, it was surveillance. Through these letters, coded in religious metaphor and scriptural reference, Thornton mapped out which parishes had influence, which priests were weak, and which congregations were ripe for spiritual invasion. One of his most important letters came that February. It was addressed to Bishop Marcoux of Quebec. The content appeared benign, an inquiry about liturgical texts and a request for francophone assistance with expanding Catholic education in the colonies. But hidden within that polite prose was a ciphered confession of intent. We must build a clergy fluent in guilt, not grace. Thornton wasn't merely a blackmailer, he was a strategist. And that's when the third phase began, indoctrination. You see, once the Thorntons had their web of influence, they needed a way to maintain it without constantly applying pressure. Fear alone wasn't sustainable. So, Father Thornton began reshaping minds. Subtly, slowly. He didn't demand loyalty, he cultivated it. He created confession councils, small groups of laymen who met weekly under the guise of theological study. But these weren't Bible studies, they were social control groups. Participants were encouraged to discuss spiritual failings among their neighbors. Speculation became confession, and confession became currency. People began turning each other in, believing they were serving God. Wives confessed their husbands' drinking. Children whispered their father's business schemes. Workers reported their master's cruelty, and through it all, the Thornton network compiled every detail. And here's the most twisted part. Father Thornton convinced them that this betrayal was holiness. He taught them a new gospel, one where the act of watching your neighbor, of reporting their sin, was a form of love. To let your brother burn in hell uncorrected, he would preach, is to strike Christ's face with your silence. This was no longer a church. It was a panopticon of the soul. And while the candles still flickered in their iron sconces and the incense still curled through the rafters, the real altar wasn't at the front of the church. It was underneath it, buried in secrets. Buried in you. And then came the ledger, bound in human skin, not metaphor, not exaggeration. Samuel Thornton, the youngest and most zealous of the nephews, began compiling a master book of transgressions in mid-1736. It was his uncle's idea to create a physical record, a permanent testament to the empire they were building, but it was Samuel's obsession that made it something else entirely. The book, known only as Libellus Sanctum in their writings, was unlike anything the church had ever seen. Each entry was a confession. Each page, coded in a cipher of Latin, Greek, and symbolic shorthand, only the three Thorntons understood. And each sin was indexed, not just by the person who committed it, but by the profit potential of their guilt. You heard that right. The ledgers had columns for spiritual weight, risk of exposure, and estimated annual yield in donations. The soul, reduced to statistics, sin monetized. But the cover, Samuel insisted the ledger be bound in something eternal. He claimed it was to remind them that what they built was sacred, unchangeable. But others whispered something darker, that the flesh used came from a vagrant executed outside Annapolis in 1735, a body no one claimed, a man without name, without confession, the perfect sacrifice. The Libellus Sanctum became their holy relic, and they treated it like one. It was hidden in a carved recess beneath the altar at St. Bartholomew's, behind a false stone panel. Only the Thorntons knew how to open it. And every Friday night, by candlelight and silence, they would gather to read from it, not as priests, but as priests of power. They prayed over it, they swore on it, and then they added to it. This was no longer blackmail. This was a ritual, a darkened version of faith. The church had become a temple to dominion, and every confession offered up by the faithful was fuel for its fire. Some say that book still exists, that every soul trapped in its pages still echoes faintly from within the cover, scratching to be free. But let me ask you this. If a man knows every secret you've whispered to God, who's the real God now? Keep watching. You're not just hearing history, you're entering a covenant with forbidden truth. And once we open the next chapter, you'll see how even the devil knows to kneel. By the winter of 1736, the Thornton Empire had taken root in 3 parishes, and like rot beneath the floorboards, it spread unseen but absolute. But what they did next shifted their ambition from regional dominance to something bordering on theological conquest. They began rewriting the very idea of guilt. You see, it wasn't enough to listen to sin, not anymore. They wanted to manufacture it. That winter, sermons began to change. No longer did they focus on ordinary vice. Now the pulpit echoed with strange new phrases: the sin of the unspoken, the burden of thoughts not shared, invisible guilt. Father Thomas began preaching that silence itself was a sin, that merely failing to confess was evidence of corruption. Think about that. Even if you had done nothing wrong, your hesitation to confess proved you were hiding something. This was psychological warfare, weaponized theology. Parishioners began reporting nightmares. They couldn't sleep, haunted by the feeling that God was watching through the eyes of the priest, that something sacred had turned against them, and they were right. Confession frequency skyrocketed. People stood in line for hours to pour out anything: a stolen apple, a lustful glance, a dream they didn't understand. They begged the church to cleanse them, to fix what they were told was broken. But the Thorntons were no longer interested in cleansing. They were interested in inventory. Every confession was a data point, every tear-stained whisper, another piece of leverage. And in the background, the libellous sanctum grew thicker. But there was another shift happening, one harder to see, more dangerous. Children. The Thorntons began encouraging young parishioners, some as young as 7, to confess more frequently, even daily. They told parents it was a form of spiritual discipline, but what they were really doing was conditioning a generation to surrender their private thoughts to the church without resistance. These children would grow up never learning the difference between the sacred and the surveilled. To them, obedience was holiness, transparency was salvation, and Father Thomas, he wasn't just a priest anymore, he was a gatekeeper to their minds. The Thorntons didn't just own the past sins of their victims, they were shaping future ones. You feel it now, don't you? That slow chill crawling down your spine. That's not fear, that's recognition. Because once you understand how guilt can be engineered, you start to question every voice that ever told you what was right. Spring of 1737 brought with it a revelation, a realization within the Thornton family that shook even their own perverse sense of order. Fear had its limits. They had built their empire on guilt, secrets, and silence. But a man crushed too long under invisible weight eventually snaps, and when he snaps, he talks. So they adapted. They didn't just need control, they needed loyalty. And loyalty, they learned, could be bought, not with gold, but with absolution. The system evolved again. Select victims, usually the wealthiest, the most powerful, were offered a different kind of confession, a private confession, one that came with absolution and immunity. Father Thornton would invite them into his private study. No booth, no witnesses, just candlelight and a bottle of imported wine. He'd sit across from them, calm and knowing, and listen. Then he'd offer something no other priest in the colony could. You are already forgiven, but now you will serve. And they did. Merchants, judges, plantation barons, men who should have exposed him instead became his agents, his soldiers, his missionaries of silence. He called them the penitent circle. They were told that their sins had been taken into the sacred book, the libellus sanctum, and through their ongoing service to the church, their souls would remain clean. But service had a price. They were instructed to bring others into confession, to identify sins in their neighbors, to promote the authority of the church in town meetings, in taverns, in court. They became spiritual spies, willing ones, bound not by fear, but by false redemption. It was genius, absolute genius. Thornton had discovered the most dangerous kind of follower, the man who believes he's been saved, by the very hand that enslaves him. And it worked. Within a year, the penitent circle expanded to 23 members. One was a magistrate, another, a ship captain responsible for routes between Baltimore and Havana. Two were slave traders who, under Thornton's direction, began funneling confessional tithe money through their transactions to hide the scale of his income. The church's coffers swelled, but its soul, hollow. This wasn't religion. It was a shadow government built in the name of sanctity, a parallel power that reached into every corner of colonial life, controlling it not with guns, but with whispers and guilt. And the most terrifying part? No one saw it, because the more they served, the holier they looked. Tell me, how many men today wear the same mask? You've seen them, haven't you? By the summer solstice of 1737, Father Thomas Thornton did something unthinkable. He declared that God had changed his mind. Standing before a packed congregation in St. Bartholomew's, his voice thundered like prophecy. He said that the age of open grace had passed, that too many souls had abused the mercy of heaven, that the Lord now demanded not just repentance, but penance, real, visible, measurable penance. What followed was the introduction of what he called the trials. At first they seemed almost theatrical, simple acts of public confession performed at dusk under the eye of the congregation. A man might kneel and recite his crimes before the altar while the others watched in silence. No one spoke, no one forgave. The priest didn't offer comfort, just silence. Then came the second level. A woman, trembling, ordered to walk barefoot down Main Street at night with a red sash tied across her eyes, symbolizing blindness to God's will. Behind her, her children followed. They were made to repeat her confession aloud. It wasn't punishment, it was demonstration. Each act served a purpose: to collapse the barrier between internal guilt and external obedience, between the soul and the flesh. The body became the vessel for spiritual debt. But the third level, that's when fear turned to fanaticism. The chosen penitent, as they were called, were selected once per month. Their sin was kept secret, but the ritual wasn't. The townspeople would gather behind the chapel as a low bell tolled 3 times. There, in the candlelit yard, the penitent would be marked, not by the priest, but by a member of the penitent circle. Branded. A small iron cross pressed just below the ribs. Silent screams in the night air. They weren't told what sin they'd been marked for, only that it had been seen, and that they must trust in God's judgment. Imagine the terror of not knowing what you'd done wrong, only that someone had decided you had. That was the point. Father Thomas had invented a system where innocence was irrelevant, where the appearance of guilt became its own proof. The town fell in line. Children watched their fathers cry. Mothers begged for marks instead of their sons. And still, they returned to the pews each Sunday, heads bowed, hands trembling, hearts hollow. Because once penance becomes public, shame becomes permanent, and control unbreakable. Autumn arrived, and with it came the one thing Father Thomas Thornton feared most: a death that couldn't be explained. Her name was Clara Bellamy, 17, daughter of a cobbler, quiet, loyal. She'd never missed a mass, never questioned the trials, never resisted confession. One morning she was found hanging behind the chapel, her lips sewn shut with thread soaked in oil. The penitent circle ruled it a suicide. They said she had suffered from inner corruption and taken drastic measures to silence her wicked thoughts. But the town didn't buy it. Clara was due to be baptized into the circle that week, a public reward for her devotion to obedience. Her death was too convenient, too scripted. Rumors rippled like wind through a graveyard. Some whispered she had confessed something too dangerous, something even Father Thomas hadn't anticipated. Others believed she'd discovered a page in the libellus sanctum that was never meant to be read, a page that didn't record sins, but rituals. The funeral was rushed, no public viewing, no final blessing, and for the first time in over 2 years, the chapel doors remained shut for 3 straight nights. Then came the dreams. Nearly a dozen parishioners reported the same nightmare. Clara, standing in the chapel, lips bloody and eyes open wide. She pointed to the confessional booth, and behind it, a hole in the stone floor, oozing something black and pulsing. Word spread fast. Clara wasn't at peace, and Father Thomas was losing control. He responded the only way he knew how, with more ritual. He declared that the town was under spiritual siege, that a demon had entered Clara before death and now sought to pollute the church from the inside. To fight it, he introduced a final rite, the purging hour. Each night at 3 a.m., bells would ring, and every home was to open its windows and repeat aloud a prayer known only as the Thorn Litany. Failure to comply would be taken as a sign of possession. Families huddled, sleep-deprived and desperate, chanting into the dark. But the darkness, it didn't move. Because Clara's death wasn't possession, it was proof. Proof that something inside the church had turned rotten, that even the faithful were disposable, and that the libellus sanctum wasn't a record of sin anymore. It was a blueprint, one written in blood, fear, and obedience. And Clara, she wasn't the last. Clara's death opened a crack. By winter, that crack had become a fracture, a fault line running beneath the entire town, and the Thornton family knew it. Whispers grew bolder. A local blacksmith, Jonathan Greaves, refused to attend the purging hour. Days later, his forge mysteriously burned down. He survived, but left town in the dead of night, barefoot and limping, muttering about voices in his walls and ash in his lungs. Then a midwife, Margaret Hollow, confessed to something strange. She had delivered a child stillborn, but claimed it was born without a shadow. Father Thomas declared it a blessing in disguise. But the people weren't blind. Something was happening, something unnatural. Behind closed doors, the penitent circle debated. Some wanted to escalate, to begin public executions. Others argued for retreat, to abandon the chapel and flee north. But Thomas, he had other plans. He turned to the book, not the scriptures, the libellus sanctum. Its pages, now brittle and warped, pulsed with annotations written in code, Latin phrases that didn't translate cleanly, dates that had never happened, symbols that matched neither Christian nor pagan iconography. He became obsessed, spending entire days locked in his quarters, tracing the symbols with bloodied fingertips. That's when he made his final transformation. Thomas began referring to himself not as Father, but as the vessel. He claimed that the Holy Spirit no longer moved through him, but had now taken residence within him, that God had appointed him Judge Eternal of Hollow's Vale. He rewrote the liturgy. Masses now opened with the phrase, "We gather not to be saved, but to be scorched clean." The trials became darker. No more branding. Now confessions required sacrifice. A finger, a tooth, a lock of hair burned before the altar. And always, always, a drop of blood for the book. The libellus sanctum fed on it. And the more blood spilled, the heavier it became. One boy tried to run, just 11 years old. He was caught, tied to the bell rope and lifted 3 times before the congregation. His final scream echoed across the fields, and still no one intervened, because by then it was too late. This wasn't a town anymore. It was a living altar, and every home, every family, every child born into Hollow's Vale was just another offering. But offerings to what? That question would be answered when the snow melted and the earth cracked open. The thaw came early in 1738, but it didn't bring relief. It brought something buried. On the first morning of spring, the ground behind St. Bartholomew's split, not from quake or storm, but from pressure. Like something beneath had pushed upward. The soil rose in a perfect circle, flowers withered around its edge, and in the center, unearthed by invisible hands, was a stone slab, etched with the same markings as the libellus sanctum. No one had ever seen it before, not even Father Thomas. He fell to his knees, trembling, not in awe, but in recognition. He didn't speak for 2 days. When he finally did, he called the townspeople to the chapel and made a chilling declaration. This is the root, the wound beneath our world, and it has opened for me. He renamed the church the Thorn Temple. The slab became its altar, and from that point on, the rituals stopped pretending to be Christian. Now, the trials were harvests. Sins weren't confessed, they were transferred. Each sinner was lashed to the slab, hands outstretched, while Father Thomas read aloud from the libellus. When he finished, the wind would shift, birds would fall from the sky, and the blood would be gone, absorbed. The townsfolk didn't rebel. They watched. Some even volunteered. Because by then, Hollow's Vale had split from time. Days blurred. People forgot their own names. Infants were born with milky eyes and hands clenched into fists they never opened. And beneath it all, the libellus grew heavier. One night, a child named Samuel Coe found his mother standing in the woods, murmuring to something just outside the tree line. She was weeping, palms upturned, offering her breath to the cold. She didn't see him, but Samuel saw the figure she was speaking to. A tall shape, faceless, cloaked in roots and smoke, with the book, his book, chained to its chest. The entity didn't move, it only listened. Samuel ran. Days later, he was found mute. His tongue had been removed, not by blade, but grown over by something black and fibrous. That's when the people finally understood. The libellus wasn't written by man, or even by one man possessed. It was a seed, and Hollow's Vale was the soil. The thing behind the veil, it was no longer just watching, it was awakening. By the summer solstice, the sky above Hollow's Vale had turned the color of dried blood. No birds flew overhead. No insects chirped. Time itself hung heavy, like wet cloth stretched across a rotten frame. Crops grew in unnatural shapes, twisted roots, spiny leaves, and fruits that bled when cut. Livestock gave birth to eyeless calves, and wells bubbled with a taste of rust and sorrow. But the people didn't run. They knelt. Father Thomas, now only referred to as the vessel, no longer walked. He floated. His feet hovered inches above the ground, trailing ash wherever he went. The libellus sanctum no longer rested in his arms, but fused into his chest, its pages still turning, but no longer visibly. He claimed the voice of God was inside him now, whispering through marrow and sinew. He called it the inversion. The promise that God had not abandoned the world, but was finally ready to burn away the lie of mercy and reveal truth. The purging hour became constant. Every hour, on the hour, bells rang, a different bell for each sin. Children learned to distinguish between the clang of envy, the knell of lust, the low hum of apostasy. Those caught failing to respond were dragged to the slab and offered. No confession, no prayer, just silence, and the sucking sound of the earth drinking their blood. But the town's final horror came not from the church. It came from the children. They had begun dreaming the same dream, a spiral staircase descending beneath the chapel, each step etched with names they didn't know, but that felt familiar. At the bottom, a mirror. In it, they did not see their reflection. They saw roots, miles of them, alive, pulsing, waiting. One girl, Esther Wren, woke from this dream with dirt packed beneath her fingernails and a symbol carved into her stomach, a perfect match for the one on the libellus's final page. She hadn't touched the book. No one had. That page had never been turned. Not until now. When the townspeople arrived at the Thorn Temple the next morning, they found the slab shattered and Father Thomas gone. In his place was the book, open. The final page read, "The harvest is complete. The vessel has served. The soil is ready. Now I rise." And from beneath the floorboards came the sound of wood bending, stone cracking, and the first breath of something ancient and reborn. The earth beneath Hollow's veil did not tremble. It exhaled. At first it was subtle, a warm gust rising from the chapel floor, thick with the scent of iron and something older than rot. Then the boards buckled, stone ruptured, and in the pit that opened beneath the altar they saw movement. Not limbs, not flesh, but roots, massive, blackened tendrils, slick with ichor, and wrapped in scripture carved into bark, living verses from the libellus sanctum. They weren't reaching up, they were pulling something down. Reality itself warped around the hole, candles bent sideways, voices reversed mid-sentence, clocks spun counter to time, and then came the sound, a single note, low, droning, inhuman. It vibrated inside the people's bones, as if each rib had become part of some hideous instrument. Children screamed, the elderly collapsed, and above it all, a voice spoke, not from the pit, but from within their minds. "I have tasted your blood. I have worn your sorrow. I have been forgotten. But now, you remember." That was when the chapel doors slammed shut. Those inside pounded on the wood, begging to be let out, but the townsfolk outside didn't move. They only stared, eyes blank, lips parted, as if mesmerized by something invisible. As the screams inside rose to a crescendo, the sky split. Not a storm, not a vision, but a crack, a jagged tear across the heavens, from which dripped not rain, but lightless fire. It fell onto the Thorn Temple and the surrounding graveyard, igniting nothing, but leaving behind a mark, a spiral, the same spiral from the children's dreams, branded onto the ground, onto skin, onto memory. And in the days that followed, those who survived did not speak of what they'd seen. Some wandered into the woods and were never found. Others wrote in tongues they'd never learned, filling walls with symbols that wept when touched. The town itself? Holes. Low's Vale faded from maps. Roads twisted. Travelers forgot their names before reaching its borders. It became a wound on the world, unhealing, and the pit beneath the church remained open, a mouth that never closed. They say the Thorn Temple still stands, but it's no longer made of wood or stone. Those who've dared to find it, drifters, seekers, fools, describe a structure that shouldn't exist. Shifting angles, impossible geometry, a place that hurts to look at, walls that whisper, doors that breathe. And at the center, the altar, now grown into a throne of root and flesh. The libellus sanctum still rests there, open, its pages no longer paper, but skin, living, pulsing, rewriting itself. Each word a curse, each line a tether. One man, Marcus Tilling, a folklorist from Harvard, claimed to have found it in 1973. He was researching religious hysteria in Appalachian communities when his compass began spinning. For 2 days, he walked in circles. On the third day, he found the spiral in the earth, burned into the moss. He stepped into the circle and disappeared. He reappeared 11 months later, barefoot and blind, scribbling spirals on the walls of a Kentucky asylum. He spoke only one phrase: "The root remembers, it dreams us backward." His tongue had been split, but not cut, grown apart. They institutionalized him, locked the drawings away, and buried the story. But his journal, what little survived, contained a crude map. And on the map was written something no one could decipher, except one man, Samuel Coe. The mute child from Hollow's Vale, now old, still silent. When shown the phrase, he wept for the first time in decades and simply pointed to his chest, then to the ground. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a command, a summoning, a call back to the root. The libellus doesn't seek believers. It doesn't want worship. It wants readers, eyes to see, tongues to speak, hands to carry the infection. Because the book is no longer bound by place or time. It appears when the wound is ready, in a library, in a church basement, in the hands of a grieving man who's lost everything and asks, why? That's the moment the libellus turns its page. Have you ever seen a book bleed? Not metaphor, not poetry, real blood, warm, dark, and still pulsing with intent. That's what Dr. Elsa Marrow witnessed in 1989 when she attempted to burn a recovered page of the libellus sanctum at a controlled university lab in Oslo. The page did not char, it did not curl, it screamed, every window shattered, every clock stopped. And the lab assistant, who'd never read a word of Latin in his life, spoke in a tongue lost since the fall of Carthage. He carved a spiral into his own neck and said, "It wants out." That's when the university locked the file. Elsa disappeared 6 months later, leaving behind only one note written in blood. It's not a book, it's a seed. And seeds don't die. They wait. Because the truth no one wants to hear is this: the libellus sanctum didn't originate in Hollow's Vale. That town was merely fertile ground. Pages have surfaced before. During the Black Plague, monks burned alive for translating its symbols. During the Inquisition, one inquisitor reportedly held a page that would not burn or tear but turned wet in moonlight. Even during the Salem trials, a midwife accused of witchcraft drew a spiral into the earth, then calmly drowned in dry air as if water had filled her lungs from within. And each time, a pattern: isolation. Faith turned inward, a child who dreams of roots. The world keeps forgetting, but the book remembers. And now, in this digital age, it's changing again. There are whispers of PDF files that won't delete, of printers that produce pages no one sent, of websites that flash the spiral for half a second before crashing systems entirely. It's no longer hiding in shadow. It's learning the light. You think it's fiction. You think this is a story. But check the room around you. Was that book always there? Is your phone camera glitching again? Did your child just draw something that looks like a spiral? Then it's too late. Do you want to know the final secret of the libellus sanctum? It never needed to be written, because it's not a record, it's a mirror. Every word, every symbol, every pulsing root carved into its pages. None of it was composed. It was reflected, pulled from the minds of those who held it, stared too long, believed too deeply. The book simply gives form to what already festers in the dark corners of the human psyche. You don't read the libellus, you recognize it. That's why it spreads so easily, because every soul carries a piece of it. Trauma, guilt, rage, betrayal, longing. The text rearranges those feelings into verses, into hymns, into commandments. And that's when the changes begin. Your voice begins to echo when no one's there. You see people with no eyes standing at the edge of your dreams. You forget your own name, but remember one you've never heard before. Thal Rain, the root beneath names. One girl in Arizona, 2007, found a page tucked in a thrifted Bible. She read it aloud. Just a prayer, she thought. Within days, her entire family vanished. Her drawings showed a house buried upside down beneath their real one. When asked why she drew it, she replied, "That's where the prayers go. That's where the worms listen." She died at school 3 weeks later, roots bursting through her eyes in front of her entire class. No one speaks of it now. No media, no memorial. Because the deeper you dig into the libellus, the more the world itself begins to twist against your discovery. Files erase themselves, witnesses vanish, locations rot away, roads bend, GPS lies. Because it's not just a cursed text, it's a protective veil. The root doesn't want to be known, it wants to be obeyed. And what better way to hide than in plain sight? In stories, in horror channels like this one, in your curiosity. There's one final account. It never made the headlines. No podcast covered it. No Reddit thread survived. But in 2019, deep in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, a lone park ranger named Harris Colton filed a sealed incident report that has since been scrubbed from every state archive. It was recovered only because of a hard copy fax accidentally sent to an off-grid forest watchtower, a place that never got the memo to forget. The report began simply, "I found the boy again, the mute one. He hadn't aged, and the spiral is back." Colton had been tracking strange animal migrations when he came upon a clearing where no clearing should exist, where the air shimmered like heat stroke and the trees bent inward, as if bowing to something unseen. In the center, a book standing upright, no table, no altar, just rooted in the ground, pages fluttering in windless air. He approached, but as he drew closer, he said he saw people standing in the woods, motionless, watching. Some were naked, some wore old robes. One, he claimed, had antlers, but none had faces, just open mouths. And then the boy stepped forward, same age as the child from 1962, still mute, still holding that same page. Colton said the boy looked at him, not pleading, not afraid, just tired, and held out the page. Colton didn't take it. He ran. He ran for 12 miles, barefoot, hallucinating shapes in the clouds, hearing trees speak in harmony. When he finally reached a ranger station, they found his boots had grown into his feet, literally fused. Surgeons couldn't explain it. He died in a hospital bed 7 days later, speaking in Latin phrases the priests couldn't decipher. The last thing he said before seizing, "The root is not a tree. It's a throne, and it's empty no longer." They cremated his body without ceremony. But 2 weeks later, in the exact place Colton described, the forest cameras all went dark, except one. For exactly 0.7 seconds, it captured a shape. Not a person. Not quite. It had too many arms. Too many eyes. And on its chest, carved deep into flesh, was a spiral. This is the final warning. If you've made it this far, something inside you has already been claimed. That ache in your chest, that pull in your gut, it's not fear, it's recognition. The libellus sanctum doesn't end, it doesn't burn, It doesn't decay. Because it was never a book. It is language before language, a living code embedded in the nervous system of creation itself, older than Genesis, older than the gods men later invented to forget it. And now, as you sit here in the glow of your screen, with your door unlocked and the night pressing against your windows, ask yourself, why are your lights flickering? Why did your dog stop barking and won't come near you? Why has the dream of the spiral come back again? The libellus doesn't need a temple. It needs a vessel, and it speaks now in pixels, in circuits, in your memory. You thought this was just a story, but your subconscious has already absorbed the glyphs I spoke aloud. They're not just metaphors, they're keys. Each section of this tale has etched deeper grooves into your perception, each word a seed, and now the root system has reached your spine. You'll see things now, glimpses at first. A woman with no pupils standing outside your window at 3:17 a.m., a child with a spiral carved into his palm, handing you a torn page in your dreams. You won't be able to look away. You'll search for the libellus, dig into the dark net, zoom into grainy photographs. You'll think you're hunting it. But in truth, it is circling you, waiting for the right moment, the right break in your psyche. And when it finds it, you will not scream, you will not beg, you will kneel, because the truth is, you were never reading the libellus sanctum. It was reading you, and now it knows